He hadn't spoken to his father in over a year until a hospice nurse whispered, "He's asking for you, and he doesn't have long." KeanuReeves stood frozen, haunted by the past, torn between walking away or facing the man who broke him. What he chose to do next left everyone speechless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The soft hum of a single desk lamp filled the silence in KeanuReeves' study. It was nearly midnight. The world outside his large windows gone still, painted in the deep blue hush of California's coastline at night. Inside, scripts and old storyboards lay scattered across the wooden desk. But Keanu wasn't focused on work. Not really. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His eyes, tired and a little hollow, drifted to a framed photograph on the far corner of the desk. Him and his mother, Patricia, taken just months ago on the porch of her dream home. She was smiling, her hand over his, a light in her eyes that still made his chest ache with gratitude. That house, that moment, it had been the culmination of a life of sacrifice, a gift he had dreamed of giving since childhood. He exhaled and reached for his mug of tea just as his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. At this hour, he considered letting it go to voicemail, but something, intuition maybe, compelled him to answer. "Hello." His voice low, cautious. A gentle, warm voice replied, "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry to call so late. My name is Marlene. I'm a nurse at Valley Pines Hospice in Hamilton." Keanu sat up straighter. His heart gave a small, uneasy lurch. Hamilton was hours away. He hadn't heard that name in months, years even. "I'm calling about Gerard Reeves." Silence. That name, his father's name, hung in the air like smoke, acrid and slow to disappear. Keanu didn't respond immediately. His throat had gone dry. Marlene continued softly, sensing the tension. "I know this may be unexpected, but Gerard is in the final stages of pancreatic cancer. He was moved into hospice care a week ago." Keanu remained still, barely breathing. He hadn't spoken to Gerard in over a year. Their last conversation, if it could even be called that, had ended with sharp words, no resolution, and the heavy door of history slamming shut once more. "He hasn't asked for anyone, no visitors, not a single call," Marlene went on, "until today." Keanu's hand slowly tightened around the phone. Kept asking if his son would come. And those words struck with a weight he wasn't prepared for. His son, not Keanu, not a name, just the title, the role, the connection, reaching out across the wreckage of decades through pain, through silence. For a moment, Keanu couldn't find his voice. He stood up and paced to the window, the moonlight outlining his profile, strong, weathered, but worn. "Ask for me by name?" he finally said, barely above a whisper. "No," Marlene replied gently. "He just kept saying, 'Will my son come?' over and over. That's the only thing he said today that made any sense." Keanu turned away from the window, hand over his mouth. The past, long buried but never gone, came roaring back. The nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering why he wasn't good enough. The empty birthdays, the broken promises, the man who had given him life and then left him to grow up without direction, without kindness. "I know this is difficult," Marlene added, "and I'm not here to pressure you, but I've seen a lot of people in their final days. Sometimes it means everything to just say goodbye, even if it's not perfect." Keanu said nothing. "You don't have to decide right now," she offered. "I just wanted you to know." She paused, then added gently, "There may not be much time." The call ended soon after, but the silence it left behind felt louder than anything else. Keanu stood in the middle of his study, phone still in hand. The photograph of him and his mother, Saul, drew his eye again. Patricia, the woman who had given him everything when he had nothing. The woman who had never said a bitter word about Gerard, even when her eyes said all there was to say. Keanu walked over, picked up the frame, and stared at it for a long moment. Then his eyes drifted to the empty wall nearby where a much older photo had once hung, faded, yellowed with time. Him as a little boy, maybe 5 or 6, sitting on a dusty porch in Lebanon, with a man who looked distant even in the picture. Gerard's hand resting on his shoulder, but his eyes elsewhere. It was one of the few images that existed of them together. Keanu had taken that photo down a long time ago. Still gripping the phone, he sat back down at the desk. His tea had gone cold. The image of his father's voice, cracked, barely lucid, asking if his son would come. It refused to leave him. There was a time when hearing those words would have sent Keanu into rage, but not now. Now it just made him feel tired, and underneath the exhaustion, something else had started to take shape. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe a question. Would I regret not going? He didn't know. He only knew that no matter how far you ran, some things had a way of finding their way back to you, even if it was in the quiet hours, by phone, carried on the last breath of a dying man. Keanu closed his eyes and listened to the silence. Keanu sat quietly in the back seat of the black SUV, the hum of the tires on the coastal highway offering a gentle rhythm to the silence that surrounded him. Outside the window, rolling hills of Northern California blurred past, wild, untouched land that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of scenery that usually gave him peace, but not today. The GPS said 40 minutes to go, 40 minutes until he would see Gerard again, his father. He leaned his head against the window and closed his eyes, but the silence didn't bring calm. It brought memories. He was 11 years old again, watching the front door slam as Gerard left for the last time. No explanation, no apology, just the echo of boots on concrete and a mother too tired to cry. There were no letters, no birthday cards, just a shadow that loomed behind every success, every heartbreak, every time someone asked, "What about your dad?" Years later, he had heard Gerard had joined the military after years of drinking, drifting, and disappearing. He had somehow found discipline in service, but even after his discharge, he never reached out, not even after Keanu became a household name. And then that last encounter. Keanu had flown to Arizona a few years back when he learned Gerard was struggling. He'd found his father living alone in a dusty trailer filled with unopened mail and bitterness. Gerard had been defensive, proud, and angry, insisting he didn't need help. But what stung more than anything was what he'd said when Keanu left. "You're not my responsibility anymore, and I'm not yours." Keanu had walked away that day, telling himself it was the last time. Some doors needed to stay closed, some wounds didn't need reopening. And yet, here he was. The hospice came into view just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. It wasn't a big place, no neon signs, no fancy entryway, just a quiet, cedar-clad building surrounded by towering redwoods and silence. A small plaque at the gate read, "St. Elias Veterans Rest Home." As the SUV rolled to a stop, Keanu took a deep breath. He stepped out slowly, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Waiting at the entrance was a woman in blue scrubs and a calming presence that seemed to settle the moment. "Your nurse Marlene?" Keanu asked. "Yes," she said gently. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Reeves. I know it couldn't have been an easy decision." He nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. She led him inside, her steps measured, respectful. The hallways were lined with faded military photos, flags, and drawings clearly made by the grandchildren of other patients. It was warm in here, cozy, lived in, the kind of place meant to feel like home, even in the end. "Father O'Connor has been with him most evenings," Marlene explained as they walked. "Gerard's not always lucid, but this morning he was very clear. He asked if his son would come. Those were his words." Keanu swallowed hard. "He hasn't asked before?" She paused. "Not once until today." At the end of the hallway was a closed door with a small nameplate. "Gerard Reeves, Room 4. Marlene knocked softly and opened it. The room was dim, quiet except for the soft hiss of oxygen. A crucifix hung above the bed, and a window let in golden light that pooled gently on the floor. Sitting near the window was a man in his 70s, dressed in a simple clerical shirt. "Mr. Reeves," Marlene said softly, "this is Father O'Connor." The priest stood, offering his hand. "It's good to meet you, Keanu." He's been holding on. "I believe he was waiting for you." Keanu looked to the bed. Gerard looked impossibly small. His once powerful frame was now sunken beneath the white blanket. His skin pale, his hands trembling slightly on top of the covers. His hair had thinned, but the sharpness in his cheekbones remained. A proud man, even in weakness. He didn't see Keanu at first. His eyes were closed, breath shallow. Then, slowly, Gerard opened them. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other. Keanu took a step forward, unsure what to expect. Gerard's voice was barely a whisper. "Didn't think you'd come." Keanu's jaw clenched. He exhaled slowly and said, "I wasn't sure I would." The silence that followed was heavy, but not angry, not like before. It was something closer to surrender. Gerard tried to smile, but it looked more like pain. Father O'Connor gently placed a hand on Gerard's shoulder. "You have a visitor, old friend. I'll give you some time." He nodded to Keanu and stepped out. Keanu sat in the chair beside the bed. He looked down at the trembling hands that had once built bikes in the garage when he was 5. The hands that disappeared for too long after that. "I thought about this moment 100 times," Keanu said quietly. "And every time I imagined walking out." Gerard's lips twitched. "You still can." "I might," Keanu said, voice soft. "But not yet." Gerard coughed, the sound ragged and thin. He reached for the cup of water on the tray beside him, and Keanu quickly helped, guiding the straw to his lips. He sipped slowly, then closed his eyes again. "You're still gentle," Gerard murmured, "like your mother." Keanu didn't reply. He just sat there, breathing through the memories, the resentment, the confusion. Gerard's voice returned, even quieter. "I kept a box in the closet. Letters I never sent. Clippings, your films." Keanu blinked, stunned. Gerard turned his head slightly, looking at him through watery eyes. "Because I was proud and ashamed, all at once. I didn't know how to fix what I broke." Keanu sat back, unsure what to do with that truth. After a moment, Gerard said, "They said I have maybe a week, maybe less. I told them I just needed to see you once." The room went quiet again. Finally, Keanu whispered, "You've seen me." Gerard let out something like a laugh. "That I have." Keanu looked out the window, the forest darkening as dusk settled in. He didn't know what would happen next, but for now he stayed. The quiet hum of machines filled the room, a rhythmic pulse of life steadily slipping away. Keanu sat in the chair beside Gerard's hospice bed, his back slightly hunched, hands clasped between his knees. The soft, sterile light overhead made everything feel suspended in time, like the world outside had stopped moving just for this moment. Gerard slept with uneven breaths, each inhale sounding like a decision his body had to make. He looked small now, the man Keanu remembered from his youth, the one who once towered in silence and whose voice could cut through a room like a blade, was now a frail figure buried in hospital blankets. Keanu's gaze drifted to his father's hand resting against the sheets. It was spotted with age, the skin thin and papery, veins like faded road maps, and yet those hands had once built things: fences, old motorcycles, wooden furniture in their first apartment. Keanu remembered watching him fix a broken cabinet once, methodical and focused. It was one of the few moments of calm he'd seen in him. The silence allowed old memories to creep in, uninvited, but persistent. He was 10 again, sitting on the floor of their cramped living room, clutching a comic book. The sounds of an argument echoed from the kitchen, his mother's voice sharp with frustration, Gerard's tone cold and dismissive. A moment later, the front door slammed, and Keanu flinched, alone again in the echo that followed. There had been too many of those moments, times when Gerard left, emotionally or physically, only to return like nothing happened. No explanations, no apologies, just distance disguised as discipline. But as Keanu sat there, another memory emerged, one he hadn't recalled in years. He was 7, standing outside the elementary school after a particularly rough day. 3 older boys had shoved him down in the playground, mocking his clothes, his accent, even the way he walked. He hadn't fought back. He just sat in the dirt, eyes burning, fists clenched. That evening, Gerard had returned early, unusual given how often he stayed out late. Without saying much, he'd asked Keanu to come with him. They got in the car and drove, silence stretching between them. They pulled up to the house of one of the bullies. Keanu remembered the boy answering the door, confused. Gerard had leaned down, calm but firm. "If you ever touch my son again," he said, voice like gravel, "you'll deal with me, understood?" The boy nodded, terrified. Keanu never had trouble with him again. It wasn't tender, it wasn't gentle, but it was protection. A moment where Gerard saw him, really saw him, and did something. Now, watching his father sleep, Keanu couldn't help but wonder how many of those moments he'd missed. Maybe there had been more, maybe not, but that one had stayed, buried deep inside him like a seed that had never been watered. He shifted in the chair, leaning back, letting out a slow breath. He didn't know why that memory had surfaced now, but it cracked something open, a space between the pain and the resentment where something else could live. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding, maybe. He reached for the small leather-bound journal he kept in his backpack, something he'd used over the years to write when words failed him out loud. He flipped past pages filled with lines from movie sets, late-night thoughts, letters never sent. With a pen he pulled from his pocket, he began writing. "I didn't come for closure. I came because I'm still his son." The word startled even him. He stared at the sentence, letting it breathe. He hadn't come to make peace. He hadn't come for some dramatic reconciliation. He came because something inside him couldn't ignore the call. Maybe it was compassion. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was the memory of a man who once stepped in to defend a little boy who couldn't defend himself. He remembered something Emily once told him years ago after a painful loss. Sometimes, she said, we show up not because someone deserves it, but because we refuse to become like them. That line had stayed with him, and maybe that's why he was here now. He looked over at Gerard, who stirred slightly, brow twitching as if chasing a dream. His lips moved, but didn't form words. Keanu leaned in instinctively. "Dad," he whispered softly. "I'm here." Gerard didn't wake, but his hand shifted slightly, almost as if it were reaching. Keanu paused for a long moment. Then, cautiously, he placed his hand on top of his father's. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just quiet contact. Warm, fragile, real. And for the first time in years, the room didn't feel haunted. It felt human. The night passed slowly. Nurses came and went, checking machines, adjusting IVs. Father O'Connor peeked in once, offering a silent nod of support, before stepping back out into the hallway. No words were needed. As dawn began to break, casting soft orange light through the blinds, Keanu stood up to stretch. His back ached. He hadn't slept, but he felt strangely awake. He stepped into the hallway, nodding at Marlene, who handed him a cup of weak coffee. "First night's the hardest," she said gently. Keanu gave a tired smile. "Yeah, guess so. Most people wait too long," she added, "to say the things that matter." Keanu looked back toward the room. What if there's nothing left to say? Marlene shrugged softly. Then just being there is enough. He nodded, and in that moment, he believed her. As he sipped the coffee, he opened his journal again, flipping to a new page. "I'm not here to rewrite the past," he wrote. "I'm here because some bonds don't break, even when they bend to the point of snapping." He paused. "And because, in the end, love doesn't always look like what we thought it would." He closed the journal and tucked it under his arm. Then, with quiet steps, he returned to the room. Gerard was still asleep, but his breathing was shallower now. Keanu sat down, not as a movie star, not as a man with fame and fortune, but as a son. Raw, uncertain, and present. The past didn't vanish. The pain didn't dissolve. But something had shifted. And whatever the next few days would bring, Keanu knew one thing. He wouldn't leave this room until it was over. The morning sunlight spilled through the narrow hospice window, warm but subdued, like the calm after a long, restless storm. Keanu sat in the corner of the room, his fingers curled around a lukewarm cup of black coffee. He hadn't slept much. He didn't really need to. There was too much stirring inside him. Memories, questions, the weight of what had already been said and what might still come. Across the room, Gerard stirred. His breathing was quieter than the night before, less strained but heavy in a different way, like a man carrying the final pieces of something unfinished. His eyes fluttered open, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the ceiling. Then his gaze turned, slow and searching, until it found Keanu. "You stayed," Gerard whispered, his voice no stronger than wind through dry leaves. Keanu looked up and nodded, not smiling, just meeting his father's eyes. "Yeah." Gerard swallowed hard. His lips trembled as if debating whether to speak. Eventually, they did. "I didn't think I deserved that." There was silence again, but not the kind that pushed people apart. This silence hung between them like a fragile bridge. "I'm not good with words," Gerard continued, his voice scratchy. "Never was. And you always needed more than what I gave." Keanu shifted slightly in the chair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. He didn't interrupt. Gerard's eyes wandered to the ceiling once more. "You know, the first time I held you, you were just this tiny thing, barely breathed, and I was terrified, not because I didn't love you, but because I knew I'd mess it all up." Keanu's gaze dropped to his hands. That was a truth they both understood. "I drank to hide from that fear," Gerard said softly. "Then I drank because I hated myself for hiding. And then, before I knew it, I was just gone, even when I was there." The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. Keanu said nothing, but something behind his eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe, or exhaustion. Gerard coughed and winced. Nurse Marlene had left a glass of water by the bed, and Keanu silently stood, lifted it, and helped him drink. "You're still gentle," Gerard murmured after a moment, "even after everything." Keanu didn't respond. He placed the cup down and sat back in the chair, his expression calm but unreadable. Gerard licked his lips, struggling to go deeper. "You know, I used to watch your movies. Not at first. I couldn't bear to. Seeing your face made me remember everything I missed. But later, when the silence got too loud, I started watching them alone, late at night." Keanu looked up, surprised. "You did?" Gerard nodded. "John Wick, The Matrix, all of it. But it wasn't the fighting or the action. It was your eyes. You always looked like you were carrying something." Keanu exhaled slowly through his nose. Gerard's voice wavered. "And I knew I put that weight there." His hands trembled slightly as he fumbled for something under the thin blanket. After a moment, he pulled out a small leather pouch, worn with time. "I kept this," he said, "all these years," and he handed it to Keanu. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph. Keanu at 5 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders, both of them smiling like the world hadn't broken yet. It looked like a snapshot from a life they almost had. "I looked at this every day," Gerard whispered. "Even when I was drunk, even when I hated myself. It reminded me there was once a version of me that might have been enough for you." Keanu stared at the photo. It took everything in him not to break open right there. "You don't have to say anything," Gerard added. "I know I can't fix the past. I can't take back what I missed. Your birthdays, your heartbreaks, your triumphs." He paused. "But I needed you to know I never stopped being proud of you, even if I wasn't man enough to show it." A lump rose in Keanu's throat. He looked up, and for the first time in a long time, his father's eyes weren't guarded. There was no defensiveness, no pride, just raw, aching truth. "You know," Gerard said, chuckling dryly, "there were nights I imagined running into you by accident. A bookstore, a coffee shop, somewhere simple. And in those dreams, I was sober. I had my life together. I'd tell you I was sorry, and you'd say, 'It's okay, Dad.' And we'd start fresh." Keanu blinked slowly. He wasn't sure if it was grief or forgiveness burning in his chest. Maybe both. "But dreams don't change the past," Gerard added. "Only truth does. And I figured if I had one last chance before I go, I should use it to say what I never could." Keanu leaned back in his chair and looked out the window for a long moment. A small bird landed on the branch outside. The hospice garden was quiet, peaceful, the kind of peace his father had never known. He turned back to Gerard. "You've said it. he replied softly. And I heard it. Gerard's lip quivered. His hand reached out shakily, and after a pause, Keanu took it. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was healing. Later that day, Father O'Connor stopped by to check in. He and Keanu walked quietly through the corridor together. The priest had known Gerard for years, back when he was just a name on a counseling list at the VA. He was waiting for you, Father O'Connor said gently, even before he said it out loud. Keanu nodded. Some men, the priest continued, can't ask for forgiveness directly. They're too afraid of not being worthy. But you being here, it told him more than words ever could. Keanu looked at him. I didn't come to forgive him. I know, the priest replied with a knowing smile, but sometimes forgiveness isn't shouted. It's whispered in presence, in silence, in staying when you have every reason to walk away. Keanu's chest tightened. He realized something then, something he hadn't been ready to admit before. This wasn't about resolution. It was about compassion. And maybe that was enough. The morning air was still when Nurse Marlene quietly stepped into the hospice room. Keanu was sitting beside Gerard, who had drifted off again, his breath shallow but steady. Marlene carried something in her hand, a small, time-worn envelope. He wanted you to have this, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu looked up, surprised by the interruption, but not startled. He rose to his feet and gently accepted the envelope. It felt fragile, as though whatever was inside had been held for a long time. Its edges were soft, the paper slightly yellowed with age. Kept it under his pillow every night, Marlene added. Never told us why, just said it mattered. Keanu nodded. A silent thank you passed between them, and she left the room, closing the door gently behind her. He sat back down, hesitating for a moment, then slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a photograph, creased down the middle, but the image still vibrant enough to spark recognition. It was Keanu, maybe 8 years old, standing near a zoo enclosure, grinning wide with a paper cone of cotton candy in one hand. Beside him crouched Gerard, looking younger than Keanu remembered him, wearing a denim jacket and a half-smile that tried to hide how uncertain he probably felt. Keanu stared at the photo, lost in it. He didn't remember this picture being taken, but the moment, yes, that day had come back now with sudden, almost jarring clarity. The sun had been out, the air smelled like popcorn and hay. They'd seen giraffes and elephants and fed goats at the petting zoo, and for that one afternoon, Gerard had tried. He'd held Keanu's hand, bought him ice cream, even tried to make him laugh with corny jokes about monkeys, and it had worked. Keanu had gone to bed that night thinking maybe, just maybe, things would be different. He turned the photo over. Scrolled in thick, uneven handwriting were 6 words. Best day we ever had. The word dad hit harder than the rest. Keanu's breath caught. He stood abruptly, as if the room had suddenly shrunk around him. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. He needed space. He slipped the photograph back into the envelope and left the room in silence. Outside, the sky was a wide, endless gray, that muted kind of overcast, that silences the world just enough to make every sound feel sacred. Keanu walked across the garden path until he found a bench near a tree that had just begun to bloom. He sat there, staring at nothing. The photograph rested in his hands, light as air, heavy as memory. He thought about how long Gerard must have carried it, through moves, through detox, through failures and relapses. He had kept it, even when he couldn't keep himself. It didn't make up for anything, but it meant something. That day, That fleeting golden day at the zoo had stayed with Gerard all these years. Not the mistakes, not the silence, but that moment of connection, the possibility of being a father, the memory of holding his son's hand. Keanu blinked, and tears rolled down his cheeks before he could stop them. He had been so sure for so long that there was nothing left between them but brokenness. But this photo, this simple photo, had cracked something open inside him. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. A breeze rustled the nearby tree branches, shaking loose a few petals that drifted to the ground. He watched them fall. Eventually, footsteps approached. "Father O'Connor," Keanu said, recognizing the priest, who sat beside him without a word. Keanu passed him the photo. Father O'Connor studied it for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "He showed me this once. Wouldn't let me hold it, just said, 'That's my boy.'" Keanu chuckled through the tears. "I didn't even know it existed." "Some things are kept quiet," Father O'Connor said, "not because they don't matter, but because they matter too much." They sat there for a while, neither of them feeling the need to fill the silence. Finally, Keanu asked, "Do you think he loved me, even when he was gone?" The priest turned, meeting Keanu's gaze. "I think he never stopped. He just didn't know how to show it without hurting you more." Keanu nodded, the ache in his chest settling like a stone at the bottom of a river. He looked down at the photograph again. "You know what's strange?" he said quietly. "I remember that day, and for a long time, I told myself it didn't count, that it was a fluke, just one good day in a storm of bad ones. But now, maybe that was the day he was trying to build everything else from, and he just didn't know how." Father O'Connor placed a gentle hand on Keanu's shoulder. "Sometimes a single good memory is all a man has, and sometimes it's enough to anchor a soul." Keanu wiped his eyes and folded the envelope closed. He would keep it now. He would carry it, not as an excuse, but as a reminder that love isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, faded, folded into corners, tucked beneath a pillow, and held close, even when everything else is falling apart. And in that moment, under that wide gray sky, Keanu understood something he hadn't before. He hadn't come for closure. He had come for truth, and somewhere in the stillness, he had found it. The sun dipped low over the rolling hills of Northern California, casting a golden hue across the dry grasslands that surrounded the hospice. The quiet hum of the evening stirred as birds tucked themselves into trees, and the warm light stretched long across the porch. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual. Gerard, pale and frail, looked up at Keanu with eyes that held both a plea and something deeper, acceptance. His breath came shallower now, more like a whisper than a rhythm. Still, there was a fire in him, however faint. "Can we go outside?" Gerard's voice cracked, but the request was clear. Keanu didn't answer with words. He simply stood, walked to the edge of the room, and returned with the wheelchair nurse Marlene had left beside the dresser earlier that afternoon. Slowly, gently, he helped his father sit up. Gerard winced, but didn't complain. With practiced grace, Keanu guided him into the chair, then wrapped a blanket over his shoulders before unlocking the wheels. As they rolled down the hallway, the quiet of the hospice deepened. Nurses paused, offering small nods, subdued smiles. Father O'Connor watched from the chapel door, saying nothing, just folding his hands together in silent blessing. Keanu opened the double doors to the back porch. The wooden planks creaked beneath the wheels as he guided his father into position, facing the sunset. The sky looked like a painting, gold bleeding into orange, melting into hues of pink and purple. A quiet breeze passed over the hills, swaying the tall grasses, as if nature itself were offering one final lullaby. They sat in silence, a long silence. Keanu didn't reach for words, he just let the moment breathe. Gerard's hands rested still on the blanket. The sun caught his profile just enough to reveal the contours of a man who had lived hard and long. Cheekbones hollowed with time, lips pursed in quiet thought. "Strange, isn't it?" Gerard finally said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "The best view of my life, and I get it now, right at the end." Keanu looked out with him. "Better late than never." Gerard chuckled, just once, and it sounded like gravel and air. "You always were better at silver linings." Keanu leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I wasn't. Not really. I just learned to find the light in dark places." Gerard nodded slowly, then tilted his head slightly toward his son. "You became the man I always hoped I could be." The words hung in the air. Keanu didn't look at him at first. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if taking in the weight of what was just said. Then, calmly, he answered, "I became the man you showed me not to be, and I still loved you." Gerard blinked. No tears, just a raw, exposed silence that neither man attempted to fill. "Why?" he whispered. Keanu turned toward him then. "Because hate never gave me peace, and because part of me always wondered if you were hurting more than you let on." Gerard shifted in his chair, eyes drifting toward the hills again. "I was, every day, but I buried it under pride and shame until all I had left was anger." Keanu stayed quiet, listening. "I watched you grow up from the sidelines," Gerard continued. "Saw your name in movies, heard stories about how kind you were, how generous. I always thought maybe some of that came from me, from somewhere deep inside." "It did," Keanu said. "The part that left taught me how much staying matters." Gerard's lips curled into something between a smile and a wince. "I deserved that." Keanu shrugged softly. "Maybe, but I didn't come here to punish you." A long moment passed. The sun now touched the ridge of the hills, casting one final golden beam across the porch. Gerard looked down at his hands, the skin translucent now. "There were nights I'd sit alone in a cheap motel and wonder what kind of man you became. I'd picture you walking red carpets, smiling like your mom, and I'd ask myself if I ever had a chance to be part of that life." Keanu's jaw tightened. "You had a chance." "I know," Gerard said quietly. "I ruined it." They both fell silent again. A single bird called from a distant tree. The breeze stirred a wind chime hanging from the porch post, sending soft metallic notes into the air. "I used to think I didn't need a father," Keanu said after a while, "that I'd be fine without one. But I carried the absence with me in every movie, every role, every hotel room after the premiere." It echoed. Gerard reached over, placing a fragile hand on Keanu's arm. "I never stopped loving you. I just didn't know how to show it." Keanu didn't pull away. He let the gesture rest between them. Then he asked, "What made you call for me?" Gerard turned his head, eyes rimmed with something more than tears. "Because I was dying," he answered, "and for once I didn't want to be alone. And because I wanted to know if the boy I left behind could ever look me in the eyes again." Keanu exhaled, slow and heavy. "He can." The sun dipped lower. A final glimmer of light danced across the hills and disappeared. The sky turned dusky purple. Gerard closed his eyes. "I'm tired," he said. Keanu gently stood and placed a hand on his father's shoulder. Let's get you back inside. But Gerard didn't move. Just give me one more minute, he said. So Keanu sat back down. They sat there, side by side, saying nothing more. That minute stretched into 10, and in that stretch of silence where pain and time and forgiveness all coexisted, something unspoken passed between them. Not resolution, not complete healing, but something closer to peace. As the wind settled and the stars began to emerge, Keanu whispered, "I'm glad I came." And Gerard, without opening his eyes, whispered back, "So am I." The hospice was quiet that night, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel sacred. A soft wind rustled through the trees outside, whispering through the branches like an old hymn. The hallway lights were dimmed to a gentle amber glow, and most of the staff had gone home, save for the night nurse and a few volunteers tending to late calls and restless souls. Inside Gerard's room, Keanu sat silently by the bedside. He hadn't moved in over an hour, his posture calm, but the flicker of his eyes betrayed the weight sitting on his chest. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the old dresser near the wall, and lavender from a diffuser Marlene had brought in, hoping to make things more peaceful. The hush of the oxygen machine kept time like a gentle metronome, steady, rhythmic, inevitable. Gerard was fading. His breaths were shallow now, each one a little farther apart than the last. The lines on his face had softened, almost as if his pain had finally stepped back. He looked tired, but there was a quiet in him that hadn't been there before, the kind of quiet that follows surrender, not defeat. Nurse Marlene entered gently and gave Keanu a soft nod, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder. "It could be any time now," she whispered. "He's not in pain." Keanu nodded, saying nothing. His eyes never left Gerard's face. She turned off the overhead light, leaving only the bedside lamp casting its warm circle of light over them, then quietly stepped out and closed the door behind her, leaving father and son alone for the last time. Gerard's lips moved slightly. Keanu leaned in, barely breathing, straining to hear. His father's voice was a rasp now, almost broken glass against silence, but the words were clear, slow, deliberate. "You were always my greatest hope." Keanu's throat tightened. He swallowed, fighting the emotion rising like a wave inside him. He blinked hard, then took Gerard's frail hand into both of his. The skin was paper thin, and it felt cold, but Gerard's fingers closed around his weakly. "I'm here," Keanu whispered. "Rest now." A long breath. Then silence. Gerard's chest stopped moving. Keanu didn't move at first. He just watched, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing, as if waiting for one more breath. Just one more. But it never came. His father was gone. The silence in the room deepened. Not heavy, not angry, just complete. It was the kind of silence that doesn't ask to be broken, the kind that holds everything at once: grief, peace, memory, love, and all the spaces in between. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. A tear slipped down his cheek, falling silently onto their joined hands. It landed on Gerard's knuckles like a blessing, or maybe a goodbye, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. Something not bound by words or time. A release, a reconciliation that didn't need to be spoken out loud. Keanu sat with him a while longer. He didn't cry loudly. There were no sobs, no outbursts, just the quiet presence of a son who had finally come home to the part of himself he had shut away for years. He reached for the blanket and gently tucked it around Gerard's chest, smoothing the corners, a reflex of love. Then he pressed his forehead to his father's hand. Thank you for the best you could do, he whispered. I understand now. He stayed that way for a while, until the room, the world, and the pain blurred into something strangely peaceful. Marlene came in eventually. She paused at the door when she saw them, then walked softly to the bed. She looked at Gerard, her lips tightening, her eyes shining. Keanu stood, brushing his palms down the front of his jacket. His voice was low. It's over. She nodded. Yes. I thought I'd feel anger, he admitted. Marlene tilted her head. And instead? He paused. Gratitude. That word surprised even him. Gratitude. Not for the mistakes, not for the absence, but for the chance to close a chapter. Not with bitterness, but with grace. Marlene placed a hand over Gerard's heart, as if to honor the man who had passed. Then she looked to Keanu. You gave him peace. Not everyone gets that. He waited just for this. Keanu exhaled slowly. I didn't know what I was walking into. I just knew I had to show up. And you did. The room seemed to brighten slightly, as if the soul that had departed left behind a warmth that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, just buried under time and regret. As they prepared to move Gerard's body, Keanu asked for a few more moments. Marlene nodded and stepped out once again. Keanu turned back to the bed, this time not as a son haunted by the past, but as a man who had chosen to be present in someone's final breath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small photograph, the one from the zoo, the one Gerard had kept under his pillow. He placed it on the nightstand. You kept this all these years, he murmured. That means something. He stared at it a moment longer, then touched the corner gently. I'll keep it now. When he finally left the room, dawn was just breaking over the hills outside. The sky was turning pale with morning, soft hues of peach and violet stretching across the horizon. Birds had begun their cautious songs, and the world seemed to exhale with him. Keanu stepped out into the chill, drawing his coat tighter around his shoulders. He didn't know what came next, but for once he didn't feel lost. The morning after Gerard's passing, a soft drizzle moved across the California hills. It wasn't a downpour, just the kind of rain that kissed the earth without demanding attention, the kind that seemed to cleanse more than soak. The sky was a canvas of muted gray, and the hospice grounds were silent except for the occasional rustle of wet leaves underfoot. Keanu stood beneath the awning of the veterans' home chapel, dressed in a simple black suit. No entourage, no cameras, no speech. He had declined all media inquiries and made it clear to everyone. This moment wasn't for headlines, it was for healing. The funeral was small, just as Gerard might have secretly wanted, but never would have admitted aloud. A few staff members attended. Some of the other veterans, those still mobile, came out in their wheelchairs or walkers, hats pressed respectfully against their chests. Marlene stood near the front, eyes damp but proud, and Father O'Connor presided with a quiet reverence that only decades of loss could teach a man. Gerard's casket was draped in a faded American flag, one that had seen better years, but somehow felt more fitting than something new. The brass plaque read simply, KeanuReeves, Father, Veteran, Forgiven. As Father O'Connor gave the final prayer, Keanu stood apart. He listened, but he didn't bow his head. His eyes were on the casket, unmoving, as if willing his father to hear every word. When the service ended, people dispersed quietly, leaving flowers, nods of sympathy, or just their presence. Keanu remained. He waited until everyone had left before stepping forward. His shoes made no sound on the wet stone. He placed a small item atop the casket. The photograph. The one Gerard had kept under his pillow. Keanu had considered keeping it, but something in him knew it belonged here. Full circle. The memory of a better day buried with a man who had finally made peace. "I hope you found the peace you never had in life," Keanu whispered, almost to himself. After a long silence, he turned and began to walk, but not toward the parking lot. Instead, he veered left toward the old, overgrown garden behind the hospice. It was a humble place. Rows of forgotten rose bushes, broken fencing, a bench too weathered to sit on comfortably. Yet something about it called to him. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was the rain making everything feel softer, less sharp. He walked slowly, hands in his coat pockets, the smell of damp soil and lavender lingering in the air. That's where Father O'Connor found him a few minutes later. "Mind if I join you?" the priest asked gently. Keanu nodded. They walked together for a while, neither feeling the need to fill the silence. Eventually, they stopped near an old rosemary bush, half dead, half alive. Father O'Connor glanced sideways at Keanu. "You stayed right to the end." Keanu looked down at the mud-stained tips of his shoes. It felt right. There was a pause. "You gave him something," Father O'Connor said. "An ending he didn't deserve but desperately needed." Keanu exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Maybe that's what grace is." Father O'Connor nodded slowly, the corners of his mouth turning up in quiet agreement. "Exactly that." They stood there in silence, the wind picking up slightly. "I used to think forgiveness was about fairness," Keanu continued. "Balance, like if you did wrong, you had to make it right, or at least try. And now," he turned his head, "now I think it's about letting go of the weight, even if the other person never says the right thing, even if it still hurts." "You did a brave thing," the priest said. "Most people don't come back when they've been hurt that deeply. They close the door and lock it. You opened yours." Keanu gave a half smile. "I almost didn't." "But you did," Father O'Connor said, "and that makes all the difference." A bird landed nearby, small, brown, nondescript. It pecked at the wet grass, then flitted off again, life moving on. Keanu looked toward the horizon. The clouds were starting to break, thin ribbons of sunlight slipping through in gold streaks. "There's so much I never got to say," he admitted. Father O'Connor's eyes were kind. "That's true for most of us, but the ones who say something, anything, before it's too late, they live lighter." Keanu nodded. He didn't ask for forgiveness, not directly. "He didn't need to," the priest said. "Sometimes presence speaks louder than confession, and sometimes listening is louder than absolution." They turned back toward the building, walking slowly. "Did he ever talk about me?" Keanu asked quietly. Father O'Connor nodded. "More than you'd think, especially in the last few months. He carried a lot of guilt, but there was always pride underneath it." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "He said you became the man he couldn't be," Father O'Connor continued. "And somehow, that made him feel redeemed, just a little." Keanu looked away, swallowing the knot in his throat. "He could have just told me." "He did," the priest replied, "in his own way at the end. That's all some men have left." They reached the back steps of the hospice. Father O'Connor placed a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "If you ever need someone to talk to, you know where I am." Keanu nodded, meeting his eyes. "Thank you." The priest turned and disappeared into the building, leaving Keanu alone on the porch. He stood there a while longer, letting the cool wind run across his face, letting the past breathe its last. In the garden behind him, the rain had stopped. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. The house was quiet when Keanu returned to Los Angeles. It always felt quiet, but this time the silence held something different. It wasn't emptiness. It wasn't sadness. It was stillness, as if the whole house had paused, letting him return without judgment, the way a mother might leave a porch light on just in case. Keanu dropped his keys onto the table near the front door. They made a soft clink, echoing into the halls. He took off his coat, hung it neatly, and walked into the living room, where the late afternoon sun spilled across the hardwood floors. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he walked to the side cabinet and opened the drawer where he kept his journals. He didn't write in them every day, not even every week, but when something mattered, truly mattered, he turned to those pages like a quiet confession booth no one else could access. He pulled out the leather-bound notebook, its cover worn at the edges, soft from years of use. He thumbed through it slowly, past old entries about film sets, memories of friends lost, quiet thoughts about humanity, aging, kindness, and his mother. Finally, he reached a blank page. He sat down on the edge of the couch, the afternoon light casting long, golden streaks across his lap, and put pen to paper. February 12th, back home. The air feels different, like something sacred followed me here, or maybe something left me behind. He's gone. I don't know how to process that yet. It wasn't the goodbye I imagined, because I never imagined there'd be one. I spent most of my life telling myself I didn't need it, that I was fine, that the door was closed and some things don't reopen. But I went, and in going, I found something I didn't expect. He paused, the pen resting lightly against the paper. His fingers tightened slightly, then relaxed. He wasn't a perfect man, not by a long shot, but he was mine. And whether I like it or not, some part of who I am came from him. The way I walk, the way I go quiet when I'm hurting, the way I still try to protect people even when I'm broken inside. He told me I became the man he always hoped to be. That's what stayed with me the most. I don't know if I agree. I think I became the man I needed him to be. And when he wasn't, I had to fill in those gaps myself. Another pause. A quiet creak came from the house settling. A memory flickered of the porch at the hospice, the last rays of sun falling across Gerard's face as he closed his eyes, finally at peace. Keanu took a deep breath and continued. Love is complicated. So is forgiveness. I used to think both were conditional, that they had to be earned or proven. But sitting beside him, watching him struggle to find words, I realized something. Sometimes love is showing up, even when it still hurts. Sometimes forgiveness is given because carrying the weight is heavier than letting it go. I didn't get the father I wanted, but I got the goodbye I needed. He finished the sentence and set the pen down, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small photograph, the one from years ago, the one Gerard had kept under his pillow. Keanu looked at the image again, an 8-year-old boy grinning at the camera, sunlight in his eyes, arms awkwardly hanging at his sides, and next to him Gerard, crouched down, caught mid-laugh, hand gently resting on his son's back. On the back of the photo were the words, "Best day we ever had." Keanu placed the photo gently between the journal's pages and closed the book. He sat back, exhaling slowly. No words now, just the sound of his breath, steady and real, filling the space. There was no dramatic music, No monologue, no swelling strings, only silence and something soft beneath it. A sense that the ground beneath him had shifted slightly, that something broken had not been fixed, but understood. And that was enough. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips. Not one of joy, not even relief, just peace. He stood, walked to the shelf where the journal belonged, and slid it back into place. The sun dipped lower outside the window, shadows growing long and warm. And KeanuReeves, son of a man who didn't know how to stay but tried at the very end, walked into the kitchen to make tea, knowing that in the quiet, he had made peace with the noise of the past. Not every story ends with resolution. Not every father says the perfect words, and not every son walks away with closure that fits neatly into a final chapter. Sometimes healing isn't loud, it isn't triumphant, it's quiet. Like the hush after a long storm, the stillness of a heart learning to beat without bitterness, the fragile peace of looking at someone who hurt you and choosing to stay anyway. Keanu didn't go to that hospice expecting forgiveness. He didn't go seeking an apology he'd rehearsed in his head 1,000 times. He went because something in him still remembered the boy in the photo, the laugh they shared that day, the faint trace of a father who tried once before the weight of life pushed him too far away. Gerard's life had been one of disappointment, isolation, and regret. But in his final days, he asked for only one thing: his son. And that mattered, because even if you arrive late, even if you arrive broken, love has a way of meeting you where you are. Keanu sat beside his father, not because he had to, but because love doesn't always need permission. It doesn't wait for things to be tidy or safe. Sometimes it simply shows up, sits quietly, holds a hand, and stays until the end. When Gerard whispered his final words, "You were always my greatest hope," he wasn't rewriting history. He was revealing it. Beneath all the silence, all the missed birthdays and unsent letters, all the pain and pride, there had been hope. Hope that one day he'd be more than what he was. Hope that his son would become what he couldn't. Hope that maybe, just maybe, love would find a way to circle back. And it did, because Keanu didn't need to erase the past to give Gerard dignity in the present. He didn't need to understand every decision or pretend nothing hurt. He simply chose not to let that pain define what was left of their story. That's what made it powerful. Not a Hollywood ending, not a grand reconciliation, but a choice. A choice to answer the phone, a choice to sit in silence and listen, a choice to hold a frail hand, knowing it once let go. And that was enough. The greatest act of strength isn't vengeance, it's grace. The kind of grace that doesn't shout or demand recognition, but quietly rebuilds what time tried to destroy. In the end, Keanu went home not with peace exactly, but with perspective, with the knowledge that some stories aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be honored, meant to be witnessed. And the boy who once longed for a father's embrace became the man who offered it without needing anything in return. That's what love can do. It can bloom in broken places. It can rise from the ruins of what should have been. It can show us that sometimes healing isn't about changing the past, but about showing up for the present. And when Keanu placed that photograph inside his journal, he wasn't just preserving a memory. He was planting a seed that said, "I showed up. I chose love. And in that choice, I became whole." Have you ever forgiven someone who didn't deserve it, but needed it? If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances. And if you believe love can still bloom in broken places, subscribe for more stories like this.